Do babies go to heaven if they die? So we would understand this potentially coming from, maybe a baby died in childbirth. Maybe it was an aborted fetus. Who knows what happens? And I would say that this question is going either from the child inside the womb, outside the womb, up to a certain age, is
Right.
my understanding of what this question is. So, Ben, this is a he-dogger.
Well, this is a he-dogger, and it's also a sensitive one based upon, you could be a student who has lost a little brother, lost a little sister. You could be a mom watching who's lost a baby through a miscarriage, had a stillborn child. And so it's a sensitive topic because obviously that's such an emotional thing to have happen. And so especially how we answer this, you need to be very careful about how dogmatic you are on it, but also just how you're communicating it to somebody. And so that's my goal behind this answer specifically, is that there's room for grace, understanding that we may not have all of the facts of what does happen to a baby when they die. So I don't want to give away my answer, but there's kind of two prevailing thoughts with this. And if you have a third, feel free to chime in with that. But the two prevailing thoughts, I just want to unpack those. Both of them have, a biblical backing where people bring these scriptural references to the table and say, this is why babies go to heaven, or this is why not all babies go to heaven. So both of those views have biblical backing. And so my goal for this is to unpack them, give the verses, and then for you, the listener, the watcher, however you're viewing this or listening to it, you go to these references and say, okay, what do I believe about this? What do I think Scripture is saying about this? Because this is something, especially for you students, as you're starting to understand what you believe and why you believe it, you have to be able to go to Scripture to defend what you believe. And so as I give these references, hit pause, hit rewind, write them down and go study them, because you need to know why you believe and what you believe. I'm not going to tell you here in the video what I hold to, per se, or I'm going to do my best not to, because I don't want my view to influence what you believe. And so the two views, I'll just take the first one. Yes, the answer is yes, all babies do go to heaven when they die. So under this view, and both views have to interpret Romans 1:20 to get their viewpoint of what happens to babies. So Romans 1:20 is kind of where we go to thinking about how no man is without excuse. So Romans 1:20 says, for since the creation of the world, his, speaking of God's, invisible attributes, both his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen. So clearly seen, everybody's seen them. His divine attributes, his eternal power, being understood, so his power and divine nature have been understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. And so through creation, all of us have a understanding, a knowledge of who God is, because he's revealed that, one, through the outward creation, and then also through our conscience, that all of us have an innate understanding that there is a creator. So none of us can deny and say, no, I didn't know, so I'm not held accountable for anything. Well, no, Romans 1:20 is very clear. No man is without excuse. Another passage in Romans is Romans 5:12. And this is where we really go to for what we would call original sin. Therefore, this is what the verse says, therefore, just as through one man sin entered into the world, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all sinned. Well, who is this talking about? It's talking about Adam. So when Adam sinned in the garden, that sin nature now has entered mankind, where all of us have that sin nature within us. And so now we have to apply this to babies. And now if you flip back to Romans 1, we really have to unpack the knowledge and the understanding of what Paul is talking about here. So if you're without excuse if you have that knowledge and understanding. So does a baby, an unborn baby in the womb who's being knitted together by God, does that baby have a knowledge or an understanding of who God is? And if that baby does, then he is without excuse. But we also understand, I won't get to that yet, that's for the second view. But we have to unpack that of, can a baby do that? Can a baby understand that? So the next popular thing for this view, you have to have an age of accountability. And that's the popular phrase for that is, baby doesn't know, baby doesn't understand, gets to a certain age, and Now they do understand, and now they're without excuse. And so that age of accountability is kind of introduced where there is an age where every man is held accountable, but because that baby has not reached that age and cannot understand, cannot know, then he is under God's grace and mercy, basically thinking through God's attributes, God's nature. And that's us saying, we believe that God will be merciful to these babies, or to, say, a mentally handicapped person where they can't understand certain things. And so how are we going to think through the soul and the eternal destiny of that person who can't understand? Two other instances, biblical examples of what this would look like. You have 2 Samuel 12, where David's son dies. David says, I cannot go to him, because basically his servants say, why are you, because he wasn't eating when his son was sick, right? He wasn't eating, he was fasting, praying, just beside himself. His baby dies, David gets up, starts eating, starts kind of getting back into the routines of life. His servants ask him, why are you eating now? Like, why are you not more distraught now because your baby's actually dead? And at the end of kind of that section, David says, well, he can't come back to me. Why would I continue to pray and fast as if my son could come back to me? I will go to him. And so we take that passage and say, oh, well, that means that we understand that David's a believer, David's going to heaven. And so for him to go to his son means he's going to see him in heaven. The other instance would be Matthew 19, when Matthew 19:14. Sorry, I need to give you guys the verses so you can write these down. So that was 2 Samuel 12:23, where David talks about going to his son. And then Matthew 19:14 I'll turn there so I'll read the verse. But this is Jesus basically blessing the little children, where the little children are trying to come to Jesus, and the disciples are saying, no, get away, children, you're not allowed here. And Jesus basically rebukes the disciples. He says in Matthew 19:14, let the children alone, and do not hinder them for coming to me, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these. So he's saying the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these, meaning these children who are trying to come to me. And so that's another verse that a lot of people under this view would go to and say, because Jesus said the kingdom belongs to these children, we can take that principle and apply it to these children who don't have the knowledge, don't have the understanding of who God is. So they're basically not without excuse, because we understand that the baby is a sinner, but God's grace and mercy covers their lack of knowledge, lack of understanding. So do you have anything to add on kind of that view, that answer? Any other verses, any other input?
No, I think you handled that well. It's the principle's there, right? The principle is scripturally sound, it's scripturally backed. You can drag that principle throughout the text and you can see that it still holds. But again, without jumping into the next section, we can't really know 100%. But that's definitely, I think that's a great summation of the first view.
Yeah, and I would even add for not to be skeptical towards those 2 Samuel or Matthew passages, but as you guys look at those, say, okay, well, was David talking about death in general? Was he talking about heaven specifically? Kind of think through that as you're studying that. And then Matthew 19, if you jump back to chapter 18 in Matthew, Jesus talks about how, I think he's talking to the disciples, where he says, if you don't have a faith like these, talking about a childlike faith. So as you interpret Matthew 19, is he talking about literal children? Is he talking about a literal childlike faith that all of us have to possess in order to enter Christ's kingdom? So that's kind of all things that we have to consider as we're trying to say, okay, well, does a baby go to heaven when they die? Yeah. So that's the first part. First part is yes, all babies do go to heaven when they die. The second part would hold, or the second view would hold to there's no way to know for sure, but God is sovereign over every person's eternal destiny. And so this view also has to go back to Romans 1, understanding that no man is without excuse. Those who hold to this view would say that literally means no man. Every person has the knowledge, every person has the understanding, but no man is without excuse. Also adding in the original sin, babies, just as man, has a sin nature. That sin nature is not, it doesn't start when you sin, it starts when you're conceived. It is passed down from your parents. So that's, you have the original sin, you have no man is without excuse. You also have Romans 3:23, where all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. You have David talking about in Psalm 51 that babies brought forth in iniquity, where it's literally conceived in sin because sin is our very nature from conception. And so that's what this view would hold to more so as they interpret Romans 1, as they interpret Romans 5, where that literally means all, including babies who we would deem from a human perspective, they deserve mercy, they deserve grace, they don't know, they don't understand. But this view would hold to that, no, these verses apply to all mankind, including babies. You can also go to passages for this in John 6:37 talks about how all that the Father gives me will come to me, basically meaning there is no one who is supposed to be saved, supposed to spend eternity with Christ, who that will not happen for. You also have John 10:28, where it's basically saying that if you are going to be saved, no man can pluck that or stop that or take you out of the Father's hand. The Father will bring that to pass. The Father will secure your eternal destiny, including babies. And then the most popular, probably biblical example from a story standpoint from this would be the story of Jacob and Esau in Genesis 25. Genesis 25:23 is kind of the middle part of that, and then it's also recounted in Romans 9:13, where basically God hated Esau but loved Jacob. And so you have these two seemingly conflicting things that are happening, going on, literally within the womb, because Genesis 25:23 talks about how when they were in the mother's womb, God told Rebekah, the older will serve the younger. Esau will serve Jacob. That wasn't normal in those cultural days, but God had a predetermined plan for what was going to happen with these two babies even while they were in the womb. And so you take that principle and you apply it to every baby now down through all of existence, and you say, okay, God has a plan for each of these babies, and his plan will come to pass. His plan cannot be thwarted, cannot be stopped or hindered. And so this view, in short, basically then would believe that all babies chosen by God are in heaven with him because of his grace and mercy shown to them. And so it makes that distinction where there are some chosen, there are some not, just as the doctrine of election would hold to, where there are some chosen and some not. And so do you have anything to say kind of about that second view?
Yeah, the big thing is that we have to understand when God said that in Genesis 25:23, and Paul even alludes to that, like you already pointed out, is that neither of them had done anything to have earned or merited God's favor. It was merely from the mercy and grace of Christ, period, dot, that anyone is chosen to be saved at all. And I think we apply this to adults, we have no issues with that, but then we apply it to babies, we do have some kind of a thing that pops in our mind, which I get it, completely understand that. But we have to understand the fact that Christ saves anybody is incredible. And what we have to hold to is the attributes of God, appeal to the attributes of God, and investigate this for ourselves. I wish this was a very clear black and white answer, but it's not. And that would be the only thing I would add, is that we don't know.
Yeah.
And it's not that we're trying to hide behind a shroud of, we don't know, because we don't want to answer. It's just like, no, we see the biblical principles, we see the theological principles, we drag it through Scripture to test it and to weigh it. It checks.
Yeah. And I think the thing to remember for both of these views is they both have to come back to the nature of God. Whether you believe that all babies go to heaven when they die, or whether you believe that some are chosen and some are not, both of those come back to the nature of God. It is because of his grace and mercy that anyone is saved, including babies or all babies, some babies, whatever. It all comes back to the nature of God, just as it all comes back to the nature of God for you and I. Our salvation, understanding that it's only by grace through faith, only through Christ, that anyone is saved. And we have to, so that's what we come back to when we're talking about this sensitive question or sensitive topic, is you have to take grieving families, you have to take people who have gone through this back to the nature of God. Because like Pastor Ethan has described, this isn't a black and white issue where we can say, for sure this is this, for sure that is that. No, we're going back to what we know for sure, and that's the nature of God. And so as you try and navigate these different situations, as you help families, as you may one day go through this or may still be healing from this type of situation, go back to who God is. Go back to God's plan, that God's plan cannot be thwarted. Go back to God being sovereign over these things. None of this is happening by accident. But we can go back to the God of all peace, understanding that we can have peace through him because we understand his plan. Well, not understand his plan, but we understand he has a plan.
Yeah.
And so that's what we have to take this question specifically back to, and others like it that aren't clear, black and white issues, that we give room for grace. We give room for wiggle room when we're talking to people. We don't try and beat them over the head with a certain answer. So,
Yeah.
good.
I got nothing else to add to that, man. I mean,
right.
it's a touchy subject,
Yeah.
and I think you did well.
Yeah.